It would be impossible in a 15 to 20 minute video to even begin to do justice to the incredibly rich history of ancient China. I will give you some basics. We will spend a little time in a later part of the term talking about the writings of Confucius. Hopefully this context will give you a good background for that. But I would just recommend, and I didn't start out as a specialist in China. I definitely don't classify myself anywhere near being a specialist, but the more I read into Chinese history, the more fascinated I am by it. And so, you know, if you want to read something fascinating, right, pick up a book about Chinese history, particularly kind of pre-modern Chinese history, I think. So let me go through some of the chronology here at the very least, and then pick up a few themes that I think are important for this, and that'll have to be good for what we do at this point in the class. So one of the things we should mention is kind of give a chronology of the different dynasties that have ruled China. Chinese civilization took shape along the Yellow River, which is in northern China, starting around 3000 BCE. So it's, you know, contemporary with what was going on in Egypt and Mesopotamia, and in Mesoamerica with the Olmecs, and in the Indus River Valley, right? So it's one of these kind of 5 early civilizations. However, it's not until around the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE or so, maybe a little bit before that, that China was, at least part of China, the Yellow River Valley, was unified under a what the Chinese have called a dynasty, right? And it's uncertain the nature of this first dynasty. We have no archaeological evidence to back this up. It's only textual stuff, but it's called the Xia dynasty. They seem to have applied a uniform set of laws and had a kind of unified rule over that territory. But by about 1600 BCE or so, they were replaced by the Shang dynasty, which ruled for about 500 years or so. And the Shang, much like the Xia, were thought to have been mythical, kind of like Troy or something like that, until there was a treasure trove of these things called oracle bones found a little over 100 years ago. This is one of the oracle bones, okay, and the Chinese characters are written on them, and then there are cracks in the bones themselves. These were used to divine the will of the gods. And along with these oracle bones, they discovered tombs of a number of these Shang kings. The oracle bones seemed, as I said, they were used to divine the will of the gods. They would write some kind of query, some kind of question on the bone itself, and then they would drill a hole in it and apply heat, probably just a heated up piece of metal or something like that, to the bone, and then it would crack, and then they would have diviners who would read the cracks, like you might read tea leaves or a palm or something like that, and other forms of divination. And then some of these bones even have the responses or the predictions, right, that come from that. And so this is the earliest written evidence we have that's pretty solid about, you know, the nature of Chinese society. And again, you know, much of this has to do with their belief in the kind of the relationship between the natural world and the supernatural world. According to the Shang, there was a chief deity named Shangdi, but then there were lots of spirits, including ancestors, and the veneration and even worship of ancestors, which has been common in Chinese history, seems to date from this period, if not before, right? There is information about that on the oracle bones. Moving forward, the Shang dynasty was replaced by a new dynasty around 1000 BCE or so. This is called the Zhou dynasty. The ZH transliteration in China is pronounced with a J sound. But the Zhou, and here we're in firmer territory, right? There are decent historical records about the Zhou, even if some of that, again, is legendary material, much like, you know, the kind of things that we find written about or during the ancient Greek period. this lists a number, I mean, these texts list a number of kings who were seen as kind of models of good kingship. King Wen and King Wu, one of whom is a kind of the model of culture. That's King Wen, and King Wu is the model of a military ruler, right, who was successful in conquering territory. But the most admirable figure in the Zhou period, which runs for about 500 years, is this figure called the Duke of Zhou. And the Duke of Zhou never sought to be king, it seems. He was satisfied with just being a good civil servant. And that tradition of offering service to the ruler, service to the state, then gets taken up by Kongfuzi, or Confucius as he's known. And the Duke of Zhou is one of his models, right? In the sayings of Confucius and his disciples, there are a lot of anecdotes about the Duke of Zhou, most of which are probably legendary in nature, but you know, he is seen as the upholder, or the perfect example of many of the virtues that Confucius is talking about. The Zhou did not have a terribly centralized political system, it seems. They allowed a great deal of autonomy. This is, you know, one of the ways to rule over a large and diverse territory, as we've seen with the Persians, for instance. So the Zhou seem to have adopted similar kinds of policies, perhaps a few hundred years before the Persians did. But this did lead ultimately, under fairly weak rulers toward the end of the Zhou period, to a period called the Warring States, right? And this is a truly kind of definitive period again in Chinese history, because it's at this point, and we're talking like late 6th into, late 6th to about the middle of the 3rd century BCE is the Warring States period. And it's at this point that important figures in Chinese culture, particularly Kongfuzi, Confucius, as well as the intellects behind the system that came many centuries later to be known as Taoism, which is in many ways a challenge to Confucianism. And so Lao Tzu, to whom is attributed the collection of sayings known as the Tao Te Ching, which is one of the kind of foundational texts of Taoism, and then especially Zhuangzi, who is kind of the foremost philosopher in the Taoist tradition, right? They all lived during the Warring States period, and it makes sense, as with other times, right? When there's a lack of order, there are a lot of people thinking about how order might be restored. This is often a fruitful situation, where people come up with plans, right, to bring order again to society. And so that context helps to inform Confucius. This is definitely something you should keep in mind when we engage that text later in the term. China was unified, we might say, and this includes not only the Yellow River Valley, but stretching down into the Yangtze Basin in the southern part of China, under the first dynasty of Chinese emperors known as the Qin. That's Qin. Q is usually the transliteration of a CH sound character in Chinese. Okay. The first emperor is known as Qin Shi Huangdi. He was a kind of absolutist ruler. He's most known kind of historically, or at least in tourist circles, for his massive terracotta army that he had constructed to outfit his tomb, right, with thousands of individual warriors. But he was quite a brutal ruler. He conquered militarily that whole territory, brought unity to it, and then created a standardization all over his kingdom in things like currency, weights and measures, the widths of roads and things like that, right? And so this brought uniformity. And one of the, I think, key aspects of Chinese culture is this tendency toward unification, that the Chinese people feel that the natural order of things is for them to be unified, that in periods of disunity, that's a breakdown of the social order, even that all is not right between the human realm and the supernatural realm. And so, this is an important thing that happens, and China has, tended, there are some later periods of disunity, but has tended to be unified under a kind of single dynasty for most of its history. That starts with the Qin. The Qin rejected Confucianism. In fact, the emperor is reputed to have killed hundreds of Confucian scholars during his reign. And instituted a thing called legalism, which is really just a kind of strict enforcement of laws, like applying very heavy punishments even for minor crimes, creating a culture of fear. It's almost Machiavellian in nature, right? So that's another way that the first emperor was able to maintain order. He ruled for only 10 years until his death, and shortly thereafter, only 5 years after his death, the Qin were overthrown by a group called the Han, and the Han established one of the most enduring empires in all of Chinese history. This is a dynasty that lasted for over 4 centuries, although toward the end of it, much like Rome in, say, starting in the 3rd century, things were kind of a mess, and order was starting to break down. But the Han dynasty is this period of great flourishing, where Confucian principles become part of the fabric of rule, of the political culture. The succession of stable emperors, right? This is contemporary with the Roman Empire, and in many ways these two present a kind of two poles of at least the Eastern Hemisphere, the Romans ruling in the western part of the Eastern Hemisphere, and the Han Chinese ruling in the East. So potent is this notion of the Han Dynasty, or the legacy of the Han Dynasty, that Han has come to be synonymous with just the Chinese people. It's kind of an ethnic identifier. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a sense of chronology, right? Searching from the Xia toward the, maybe the beginning of the 2nd millennium BCE to the Han, which runs until the early 3rd century CE, so a little over 2,000 years of history that I've detailed here. In my class that I teach topics in the medieval world, I go a little, I go further and talk about the Tang and the Song and the Ming dynasties. A few key concepts. So starting with the Zhou, the Shang, as I said, had a concept of a chief deity named Shangdi, but under the Zhou, there was this notion, and the Chinese word for it is Tian, but this notion of heaven. Heaven is not, this is kind of the main God, as it were, or force, we might say, in the universe, right? That it's kind of an all-encompassing ruling force over all things natural and supernatural. And the emperor, or the ruler, was thought to have the mandate of Tian, or the mandate of heaven. And this is something, of course, that stretches into, all through Chinese history. The emperors always have this claim, and, when order breaks down, heaven has withdrawn its favor, and it needs to be sought again by imposing order. Under the Han, but to some extent even before that, there is a great emphasis on meritocracy. That is, anyone who gained an education or showed promise could rise to a high level in Chinese government or society. There certainly was a privileged group at the top, both kind of generally and locally. But, especially under the Han, with the establishment of Confucianism as the governing philosophy, there were schools set up to teach Confucian principles, and graduates of these schools could go on to kind of posh government jobs and then give kickbacks to their hometowns, their families, and so, poor villages would send their best and brightest off to these schools. And this is something that continues for a couple thousand years in Chinese history. It begins with the Han Dynasty. We see it maybe to its fullest extent later in the later dynasties. But meritocracy is a thing. There's less of a kind of aristocracy I think, at least hereditary aristocracy in Chinese history than there is in many of the kind of Western cultures or Western civilizations. And then I already talked about unification as a key thing. We should note that the development of religion and these philosophies one of the important things that, and kind of the main theme that we'll be engaging, Confucianism in particular, with its concepts of Li ritual, Ren humaneness, and the concept of the Junzi, the gentleman, right? What does it take to become a Junzi? Well, one must not only complete rituals to celebrate the gods or to acknowledge the gods, but one must do it with the right spirit or the right mindset, which is the Ren. That is, one of the key pieces of evidence that that Karen Armstrong uses, to sort of label this a key moment in the axial age, right? That's all over the world. There are these civilizations that are producing what is essentially the golden rule. Well, Confucianism does that. It's you don't just go through the motions of ritual. You need to do it for the right reasons. Whereas Taoism is kind of a rejection of that, but in some ways it gets to the same place. That is, one must have the right mindset. Although in their case, it's not about performing things or observing the proper functions of society, the proper relationships in Confucianism. It's about being one with the Tao, which is this impersonal force that runs through everything, that controls the whole universe. And so going with the flow of Tao, right, is the point of Taoism. But again, it's all about right mindset, right? The ethics are based on having your mind in the right place and doing things with the right intention. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay, we'll come back to Confucius. We'll come back to some of this context later. If you have questions, please ask them. Discussion boards and the live sessions or whatever. Thanks.